Hello, and welcome to another Metroid Monday on Shatter Our Souls. Now, today I'm taking a little bit of a different approach to the video as a whole. First things first, we're not starting at a save point. We're starting at a boss fight. The next boss is the Alpha Blog. The Alpha Blog is basically just a standardized enemy, the blog enemy, but about 7 times more health. It's just tankier. Little something I haven't really touched on too much regarding the experience of hyper mode is as I'm playing it, I'm realizing that hyper mode is excessively more difficult than I had initially expected. Now, this might not seem like much. What do I mean by it? So, when I was touching into Metroid Prime 1, there was many times where I sat and fought an enemy or a boss for a longer period of time than I would have liked. Think of the Parasite Queen. She hits hard, she takes excessive amounts of damage, and that's really all there is to write home about. The average player, if you have access to hyper mode, isn't going to be able to, or isn't going to have to worry too much about fighting said enemy. However, hyper mode, as the game progresses, amps up those numbers and the difficulty of each enemy exponentially. So the alpha blog in a normal playthrough would probably be defeated by now. And the reality is that I'm only doing chip damage to this thing. Bosses in Prime 2 are, in my opinion, far stronger than the bosses in Prime 1. Prime 2s just have a little bit more oomph behind them. Partially because the Prime 2 bosses are very commonly have invulnerability phases. As the Alpha Blog, for example, if it doesn't have its mouth open, is or impossible to deal damage to. And I'm using that as a, shall we say, a explanation for why. Because Prime 1 has a lot of enemies that, if you don't hit the target just right, you're in trouble. Prime 2 is much more specific in what animations can be hurt and which ones can't. Now, over the next couple of videos, I am intending to blitz the last of Torvus Bog and head into the Sanctuary Fortress. Alpha Blog, being as tanky as it is, showcases a little bit of what I mean by it. We're getting out of the realm of standard bosses for Metroid, and more so into the types of bosses you challenge in RPGs, like Final Fantasy, where the Final Fantasy XIV raids are usually 20 minutes long on a successful attempt. So, a little something to look forward to, I guess. Next aspect about this, I suppose, has to do with most of the major bosses in Metroid Prime 2. Aside from the Guardians, are usually oversized versions of the same type of enemy, or of a common enemy. The Alpha Splinter, the Alpha Blog. These the Alpha Splinter, the Alpha Blog, you also have the Grapple Guardian and Quadraxis, which are bigger, badder versions of standard enemies that you come across. There are other ones as well, but these ones are the ones that come to mind first and foremost. If you want to go a step further, you could also say that Chica and, what's it called now? The worm guy in Agon Waste are all technically oversized or overpowered versions of bosses from earlier sections in the game. Now, I have to ask the question, if you would be doing this yourself, would there be a different route that you would have taken? Or do you think that I'm doing this in the way I probably should be, if not a little bit on the slow side? Because after taking down the alpha blogg here, I'm thinking it's time to get some more gear. Sitting at 50 missiles at max means I'm holding up decently okay. But at 500 health and struggling as much with the past couple of bosses as I have, it's time to step away from that and look at finding ways to improve Samus's health and overall lifespan in boss fights, because it's going to be what brings me to the next section of being able to handle an entirely new group of enemies. Okay, pure curiosity, does anybody know what the light at the top of the visor is for? Just above the health bar there. Because I apparently am oblivious. I don't think I've ever noticed that light before. And it makes me wonder just how many other small details I've been missing. I don't know. Anywho, directly below us, where we fought the alpha blogg, is another major boss we'll be fighting later on. The bomb guardian. It is a plant-like beast that really doesn't have a whole lot going for it as far as its boss design. It's more relaxed than I think a lot of people would give it credit for. But it's one of those bosses. Actually, a lot of the later game bosses kind of fall under this, shall we say, this design philosophy. It's what I'll call the rule of three. Nintendo is kind of famous for the rule of three, that and eyeballs in weird places. But the rule of three basically dictates that you have to deal damage to an enemy X number of times for them to be defeated. And so the Bomb Guardian has to be hit 4 times. Not the end of the world. The other one that I'm thinking of is the Spider Guardian in the Sanctuary Fortress, which has to be hit 3 times. Both of these bosses are very short form in what is expected of them. They're very simplistic in design, and it's more about can you deal with they're more like puzzle bosses than they are standard combat bosses. And that seems a little bit off because a lot of Metroid's bosses fall into the realm of how do I deal damage? Just in general. Looking at Dragon, for example, in Super Metroid, where there is the trick of getting it to grab you and then using the grapple beam on an exposed electrical wire to effectively cook Dragon. These, shall we say, boss types have always existed in Metroid, but I find that in 2D games there you get away, or it's 2D games are able to get away with that a lot easier than 3D games are. Partially because 3D games struggle a bit more with overall space. Um, a good way of looking at it from the perspective of game design is to turn towards Super Mario. Super Mario 64 had to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Up until that point, most of the Bowser boss fights fell under very strict cause and effect relationships. Oh, Bowser jumped over such and such, and now you can either jump over him or go underneath him and break the bridge. Very simplistic design, but it worked. Mario 3 had it where you had to try to convince Bowser to fall in a specific spot to get him to fall off the arena. Again, simplistic design and well thought out. But how do you translate that into 3D? While they have been able to make those kinds of situations work in 3D at this point in time, in the early days of the Nintendo 64 and GameCube, getting an AI to work in the appropriate way to do that in 3D environments was incredibly difficult. Prime 2 looks at that and looks at the puzzle box design of bosses and tries to find loopholes around them. Finds ways to make it so that the thought processes around how do you get to deal damage at all is the first question you ask. You can't just wail on the parasite queen. You have to hit it in the mouth for it to deal optimal damage. You can't just wail on the hive mecha. You have to whittle it down and get it to open up so you can deal damage to it directly. Things like this, while they have a small effect in the moment, have a larger effect over the duration of a game. So, looking at, I suppose, the boss design in and of itself, Prime... The Prime Trilogy's boss design is often much more puzzle box in nature than I think a lot of people actually realize. Um, but although it is a puzzle box in nature, doesn't mean that it was necessarily meant to be. Now, it is something that I've kind of poked at, but hyper mode did not exist in a true form until after the trilogy version of Metroid Prime was released. Or sorry, until Prime 3. And the trilogy went back and gave a hyper mode difficulty to 1 and 2. And that's all well and good. The Prime 3 did it partially because they realized that they had oversimplified the combat system, and it became for veterans of 1 and 2, it became difficult to really settle in on what the difficulty of Prime 3 should have been. So they made hyper mode, where once you have beaten the game once, you can replay it at a higher difficulty. I like hyper mode. I think that hyper mode does a lot for the longevity of these games, especially given the fact that I've been playing the Prime trilogy for 15 years. Knowing that aspect of it, I could say with my personal experiences that the Prime trilogy does very well with what it is given. But I also believe that there is room for improvement. Because the games were never designed initially with hyper mode level difficulty in mind, it makes a lot of the standard enemies and bosses fall outside the range or the realm of what the game initially asked of the players. Put in a slightly different way, because it was never designed with it in mind on a initial run of the game, it means that there are a lot of times where the player base might stop and feel that it is unfair. I believe that it is still fair in that Metroid Prime and the Prime trilogy in general is not an overly hard game or an overly hard series. The hyper mode offers a lot to the player in terms of replayability. But in terms of an initial playthrough on hyper mode, it requires a lot more time and patience than the rest of the or than the standard game itself would. That's my 2 cents on it, at least. But be that as it may, here we are. Now, I am back in the Agon Waste because I had my teeth kicked in by the by the Speed Boost Guardian. And I don't exactly want to replay that. Unfortunately, was kind of stuck in I didn't want to backtrack this because it feels like I'm not making as much progress as I would like in this series. But that's kind of something that Prime 2 is known for. Prime 2, for all that it does right, because its bosses on a standard playthrough are significantly harder and longer than anything else in the trilogy, it is to be expected that I'm not feeling as though I'm making as much progress, because the very design philosophy of Prime 2 is radically different. So I'm choosing to give myself a little bit of grace here on the time it takes me to get from A to B. Because Prime 2 is a harder game. And there's nothing wrong with that. Anywho, one of the things that I don't think gets enough attention comes down to, I suppose, in part, enemy design. But also, I don't believe that the small, finer details get enough of a notice. This entire section that I just finished is technically optional. But the damage output boost that you gain from gaining the Dark Burst is well worth doing so. The Dark Burst is effectively the super missile variant of the Dark Beam which does about the same as what the Ice Beam's Ice Spreader would do. Significantly stronger burst of energy. It does a fair bit more for the player in terms of their well-being, their health, etc. in various circumstances. What it loses out on by virtue of what it is that the dark beam uses far more ammunition than other damage types, shall we say. So, I'm going to touch in on this a little bit. The ammo consumption system in Prime 2 is not bad. It is well worth looking into and has an in-universe, or at least a reasonable to explain reason for it being what it is. However, there are flaws, and these flaws are with anything. The biggest flaw with the Dark Burst cannon and the various upgrades that you can get on that particular regarding that is that a large portion of these upgrades, shall we say, are they consume more ammo, and it becomes far harder to manage your ammo consumption in general because we're constantly having to go around using it with far more consistency than you would your standard missiles. Now, I'm pretty sure if you've watched my Prime series that you may have noticed that I don't use missiles too often. I use super missiles constantly, but standard missiles I neglected. It wasn't that I dislike using missiles, although I'll admit the missiles in and of themselves really weren't my cup of tea. It was the fact that the super missiles had so much more going for them, comparatively to the alternative. But the dark burst and the light burst, I think, sunburst, something of that nature, is a very different beast in terms of how it functions. These two use 6 times more ammunition than a charged shot, which is already incredibly ammo depletive as is. If I were to use that as a branching off point, it would mean that at absolute maximum ammunition, I can fire off 6? 250 ammunition, 24 divided by 3. Sorry, 8 of those. But these 8 these 8 shots are significantly harder, or hit significantly harder than a super missile would. And they do significantly more for the player. They're just very very resource heavy, very resource depletive in general. Which is why I tend to avoid it, because I'm one of those RPG players that I will have a stockpile of basic healing items maxed out from the second dungeon of the game, and I won't touch it until I realize I'm fighting the final boss, which is usually halfway through the 3rd phase. Knowing that, I unfortunately, unintentionally, make Prime 2 harder on myself because I struggle to swap to a weapon that is better for the circumstance than what I'm currently using. Anywho, with everything said and done, if you like what you see, are curious if I will ever be able to beat this, drop a like, leave subscribe. We'll catch you next time. Until then, I hope you have a good one. And next time on the Metroid Monday, we are going to be tackling the Grapple Guardian. The Grapple Guardian is going to be, I'll be honest, it's going to overstay its welcome. So, until then, have a good one.